رؤساء أمريكا يتغيرون، إلا أن السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية سائرة على المسار نفسه لا تتغير، مسار تحدد خطوطه أطراف محددة. السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية تجاه الشرق الأوسط ومن يهندسها من الداخل. معكم زينب الصفار، تابعونا. مفلسة ومتهورة، استغلالية ولا أخلاقية، قائمة على أساس تأمين مصالح الولايات المتحدة المتمثلة في احتكاراتها النفطية وكارتيلاتها العسكرية. تلك هي السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية تجاه منطقة الشرق الأوسط. هي بحسب الخبراء والمراقبين سياسة ثابتة ولا يعد التغيير الذي يعتريها أو ما يبدو للبعض أنه اضطراب إلا إجراءات تكتيكية لا تمس جوهر السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية، سواء منها في فلسطين أو لبنان أو العراق أو أفغانستان أو تجاه إيران وموضوع سلاحها النووي وعموم منطقة الشرق الأوسط. سياسة أحادية القطب ما فتئت ودأبت على تأمين هيمنة الولايات المتحدة على منطقة الشرق الأوسط بكل طاقاتها وموقعها الاستراتيجي، فبسيطرتها على هذه المنطقة الحيوية تتحكم في إمدادات الطاقة اللازمة لجميع اقتصادات الدول المنافسة لها، وخصوصا الصين واليابان وأوروبا كقوى اقتصادية منافسة لها على المستوى العالمي. لذلك تسعى الولايات المتحدة من خلال سياستها التي تبدو مضطربة في الشرق الأوسط إلى إدامة قضاياه ومشاكله وأزماته، لا سيما المتعلقة بأمن طفلتها اللقيطة إسرائيل، حيث يوفر لها ذلك الظرف المناسب لإحكام سيطرتها عليه وإبقاء تدخلها السافر في شؤونه العامة الداخلية والخارجية. مديرة شؤون إيران وأفغانستان والخليج في مجلس الأمن القومي الأمريكي في عهد الرئيس جورج دبليو بوش، هيلاري ليفيريت، التي ترأس شركة استشارية في مجال المخاطرة السياسية، الكاتبة والمحللة السياسية المختصة بالشؤون الدولية والخارجية. كيف ترى نهج السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية اليوم؟ ومن يقولب هذه السياسة في هذه البقعة من العالم؟
Let's go change the world. Thank you, everybody.
Hillary Leverett, former U.S. National Security Council expert on Iran and the Middle East. Welcome back to the Inside, ma'am.
Thank you.
Well, actually, as an expert in foreign affairs and the Middle East in particular, and as a person who assumed a prominent post on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, who really shapes the U.S. foreign policy, particularly towards the Middle East?
It's something on one level that I think is structural. There's something structurally determined about how the United States conceives its national security strategy that goes back almost to the beginning of the formation of the United States. The United States was never comfortable to be a small set of states surrounded by other countries. We were never acceptable. It was never acceptable for us to be British colonies surrounded by French or Spanish. We had to take over first the continent of the United States to be secure, and then really to pacify the whole hemisphere of North and South America to be secure. The United States has gone beyond that to, in a sense, pacify Europe. We tried to do that in Asia, but we came up against China. And we've tried to do that since the end of World War II, I think, in a determined way in the Middle East. Part of this is really structural, that this is how the United States conceives of its national security, that every critical region of the world needs to go along with U.S. policy. So part of what this means is that if a president comes into office without a clearly articulated, defined vision for something different for the United States, he or she will be captured by this mentality in the American political culture. So, for example, I think that President Nixon came to office with a very different strategy, a very different concept of how he saw where the United States was in the world, where when he came into the office in the end of the 1960s, he saw the United States in a pretty bad position economically, strategically, militarily. And he decided we needed to stop pursuing hegemony and dominance in Asia, accept the People's Republic of China.
That's why he went to China.
And that's why he went to China, to recalibrate the U.S. position, gain more legitimacy for the United States in the world, and assert our leadership and our power in a much more effective way. Not to give up our leadership of power, but to do it more effectively. For the Middle East, a similar dynamic is in play, that without an American leader who can look at the Middle East differently and accept that we are not going to be able to dominate the Middle East, we cannot achieve hegemony here. And the more we try to do it, especially in a highly militarized way, we hurt ourselves more, we lose our influence, and we lose politically, militarily, and economically. So it's something where I had some hope when President Obama came to office that he understood this. He talked in his first campaign in 2008 about that. And that's why he said not only would he withdraw American troops from Iraq, but he was determined to change the American mindset. He called it the American mindset that had got us into the strategic mistake of invading and occupying Iraq and Afghanistan for a decade. He was going to change that mindset. But the first thing that he does when he comes into office is he says, yes, I'm going to withdraw troops from Iraq, but I want to keep 18,000 there. The only reason he didn't was because the Iraqi parliament said no. So immediately, Obama's what we would call maybe instinct for a different strategy collapsed. And I think part of that is he lacks presidential leadership, but also because this idea for hegemony, that even though it may be harder to do, it's still something that Americans want, and that many Americans see as necessary for a global political and economic power. And I wonder whether Syria will be potentially the end of the imperial project. That in the post-Cold War era, we start with Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. Each of these interventions becomes harder for the United States to control politically. Yes, we can go in and overthrow a government, kill its leader, but we have a harder time in each of these interventions with controlling the political outcome. So we can go in and overthrow Saddam Hussein, but we lose the war. Syria could be a turning point, because in
what
Syria,
sense?
In Syria, we may not even be able to overthrow the government there.
Yes, because the government of Bashar al-Assad is still very strong despite everything.
It is still very strong, and there's no sign that it's going to lose. That 2 years after an American president told the world publicly that President Assad must go, every other time in history when an American president has said that or acted like that, whether it was in the Middle East or outside, the United States has used the full force of the American military and has achieved that goal. If he can't do that in Syria, and he hasn't been able to do it for 2 years in Syria, that could be coming close to the end of the American imperial project in the Middle East, because it will show to all publics, particularly in the Middle East, the limits of what the United States can accomplish.
You say in the sense that the United States really misused the primacy, misused its supremacy in ways that were grossly counterproductive for its own interests and for America's standing in international affairs.
Yes, this particularly with the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the defeat of the Iraqi military, the United States could have, we had put 500,000 troops into the Middle East in 1990, 1991 to eject Iraqi troops from Kuwait. We could have left at that point. But instead, we reactivate the Fifth Fleet, the American naval presence in the Persian Gulf, to be an on-the-ground, constant presence of tens of thousands of troops in the Persian Gulf, to in effect occupy parts of Saudi Arabia with tens of thousands of troops. We decide then, in the 1990s, to impose our first ever comprehensive embargo on the Islamic Republic of Iran. We had a choice. We didn't have to come into the Middle East like that in such a highly militarized way, in such a way to try to determine the economics of a country like Iran. We could have pulled back, and we could have said, we're going to allow each of these states to rise on their own merit. We will trade with these states. We may have arguments with these states, but we will settle those arguments in a in a court, in a discussion, in a negotiation, but we're not going to settle these arguments by invading the country, sending troops, or imposing crippling sanctions that cost thousands of lives. But we didn't do that. Instead of balancing, we decided to pursue this highly militarized hegemony in the region, and that has cost the United States.
Under the pretext of liberating the peoples and the nations.
Under the pretext that liberating them, but also this idea of American exceptionalism, that everybody really wants to be like the United States. Everybody wants to be in a secular, liberal, political and economic order. That in the 1990s, that was the driving force to justify American hegemony. Is it still a
secular, liberal, economic, political order in the United States nowadays?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, there is a very clear determination to keep religion and politics separate. But Americans in some ways have become more religious. Many Americans are organizing on the basis of religion. The evangelicals, for example, in the United States are organizing much more than they did 20 years ago on that basis. The American Jewish groups are organizing much more on that basis in the United States than they did 20 years ago. So you do see this attempt in the United States to organize more on a religious basis, but there still is a very clear determination to keep it separate, which in an American context I think makes sense.
From 2001 to 2003, you are one of a small number of US diplomats authorized to negotiate with the Iranians on issues pertaining to Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda and Iraq. What can you tell us about the negotiations back then? Who did you talk to and what did you reach?
It was very interesting. American officials have essentially been prohibited from even saying hello to an Iranian diplomat. We have no diplomatic relations and we're essentially prohibited from attending any events for Iranian officials or anything. There's one exception, and that is in a multilateral context, especially if you're at the United Nations in New York or maybe in Geneva. If you're part of a multilateral group discussing another issue, so not US-Iranian relations, but another issue, you can sit with the Iranian and you can talk to the Iranian and have a negotiation and a discussion about the other issue. So that's how I came into these discussions, these negotiations with the Iranians. Shortly before 9/11, back in 2001, I was assigned by the State Department to the US delegation to the United Nations in New York. The United Nations then, first under Lakhdar Brahimi, and then someone else took over, but it was Lakhdar Brahimi's idea, that he created a group to talk about and negotiate about Afghanistan when it was under the Taliban, before 2001, when there was the crisis of the Taliban inside Afghanistan ruling the country. He put together a group of the 6 countries around Afghanistan, which included Iran, and plus the United States and Russia. And I was the person at the US mission that was assigned to represent the United States in this group. And I then met regularly with my Iranian counterpart as part of this group of countries dealing with the Taliban. And what I found there was something, in an American context, was pretty shocking. The Iranian diplomat was the most knowledgeable person in the room, the most rational person in many ways in the room, really thought about things in a variety of ways.
Who was he back then?
He was, I don't want to really give his name because he was just a career diplomat, not somebody in the public light, and he's not a public figure. But he was a career diplomat, had served in many places in Central Asia for the government of Iran, and was serving for the government of Iran in New York. With the attacks on 2001, on 9/11 in 2001, and my Iranian counterpart again came to me and said, we need to really continue this work as part of the 6+2 on Afghanistan, because it's even more important now for the countries to...
In the wake of what happened.
In the wake of what happened, for there to be not just the United States going after the Taliban, but for there to be a more unified, coordinated effort. And in particular, the United States had never thought about Afghanistan in any kind of military or security way. We would say that we didn't like the Taliban, but we didn't really care. And so here we were after 9/11 with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, with the Taliban there, and no idea of how to deal with it. But Iran, for the years before that, had worked with Russia and India to train, equip, feed the Northern Alliance, the only force on the ground in Afghanistan that was against the Taliban. We had washed our hands of it. We had nothing to do with them at that point. And so my Iranian counterpart said, we really should discuss this because this is the only force there. And so we really started to discuss how the Northern Alliance could work with other countries, including the United States, to overthrow the Taliban. But more importantly than that, even though the military campaign was going well in this coordinated fashion, and the Iranians, the Russians, the Indians were all supporting this, more importantly was the Iranian focus on what happens after the military campaign. And there, again, I was shocked from an American perspective because the Iranian officials, and by this point the group had expanded to some more Iranian officials, not just my one counterpart in New York, but some officials we would have meetings in Europe, and they would come from Tehran, we would come from New York and Washington. They started to focus on what happens after the military campaign. They started to focus on the need for there to be a constitution, for there to be elections, and for there to be a representative initial interim authority that was Afghan. That there not be an American occupation, but that there be an Afghan government that was participatory. This was pretty shocking for Americans because we had never thought of Iran as interested in a constitution, even though of course they've always had, the Islamic Republic has always had a constitution.
These are the misconceptions.
Exactly,
yes,
it really fed into the misconception, but at least on Afghanistan it wasn't as politicized or as emotional as it is for Americans to think about Iran in more of the Israeli-Palestinian context. This was Afghanistan. It was different. We were able to hear those arguments and work with Iran to help Afghanistan write a new constitution, have a representative political order, and set a timetable for elections.
Right. Hillary, we're going to stop now for a short break, and then we'll come back to elaborate more on the American foreign policy towards the Middle East. A short break, and we'll be back. Stay tuned. المسؤولة السابقة في مجلس الأمن القومي الأمريكي والخبيرة في شؤون الشرق الأوسط هيلاري ليفيريت كيف ترى التأثيرات السلبية للوبي الإسرائيلي على السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية، وما هي العوائق السياسية والثقافية التي تحول دون تغيير البنية في السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية.
It's very interesting. The Israel lobby is a relatively new phenomena in U.S. politics and its impact on U.S. foreign policy. Of course, the United States voted for the creation of the State of Israel back in 1948. But from 1948 to 1967, the United States did not really have a very good relationship with Israel. From 1948 to 1967, the United States gave Israel relatively little economic aid and almost no military aid. Israel built up its military from France at the time. France was supporting Algeria and Israel. Those were its two major clients in the Middle East. The United States really wasn't. It wasn't until after the 1967 war when Israel was able to show the United States that it could unilaterally invade Arab countries, seize Arab territory, particularly territory from Arab states aligned with the Soviet Union, that the United States became interested in Israel. So this idea that the United States is interested in Israel because it's so democratic is something that's very much in the American idea, is not supported by the record, because arguably you may consider Israel to never have been democratic, but arguably it was at its most democratic from 1948 to 1967, when at least it did not occupy East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan. At that time, when it was arguably, for Americans, at its most democratic, the United States didn't support it. This other idea that the United States supports Israel because of the horrors that happened in the Holocaust is also something not really supported by the record, because if that were true, then why didn't the United States support Israel from 1948, right after World War II and the Holocaust, until 1967? Why? Because it wasn't useful. what the Israel lobby has been able to do from 1967 steadily until today, it has been able to, and particularly after the Cold War, with the collapse of the Soviet Union.
With the fall of the Soviet Union, yes.
It has been able to, yes, use money to donate to political candidates, yes, use its influence in the media and other places, but most important, it has been able to make the intellectual argument that it uniquely can support American dominance and hegemony in the Middle East by keeping Arab states subordinated to it. So it's not just that the United States can invade any country in the Middle East whenever it wants, with whatever amount of force it wants, but Israel can. So the United States doesn't always have to get its hands dirty, the Israelis can do it.
Hey, here, what can you tell us about the political and cultural obstacles to truly constructive change in the American foreign policy?
It's principally this idea of dominance, this cultural, deeply embedded cultural idea that the United States needs to be able to dominate the world for itself to be safe. So, for example, President Woodrow Wilson, back in the early 1900s, declared that it was America's determination to make the world safe for democracy. This means, to make the world safe for democracy, means essentially to pacify the rest of the world so that America's political order can be quote-unquote safe. This is a very strange idea. My husband and I, Flint and I, think instead Americans should be trying to make democracy safe for the world.
True.
And so it's a very deeply embedded cultural idea, though, that the only way America can be safe is if everybody else is subordinated to American power and influence.
Right. You, on the 10th anniversary of the US-led invasion of Iraq, you also co-written a piece on the Halabja crime, and you talked about how the Americans justified the use of chemical weapons back then when they were used against the Iranians. Mm-hmm. What can you tell us about this, please?
You know, it's a very interesting...
It seems that when we like, we can justify the use of chemical weapons.
Yes, I mean, and American officials are on record for saying that, well, we don't necessarily like the use of chemical weapons, but we didn't want Iran to win the war, which is something that the United States, you know, I think eventually will have to answer to, and will come back. Will come back to hurt the United States. This very deeply embedded double standard that the United States could not allow. I mean, the big crime that the Islamic Republic committed was to be independent. But we couldn't allow that. We couldn't allow this independent governance. It's something that's going to come back to damage us. In particular, here with the use of chemical weapons, it's something where the United States likes to have treaties that bound other countries that we can use against them. But we don't like to have any of those treaties or any of those international mechanisms or institutions applied to the United States, again because of this idea that we need to be able to dominate others. But it's something where it will end up, we could end up by this highly politicized use and excuse for chemical weapons, for nuclear weapons proliferation. We will end up having countries like Israel and India with nuclear weapons. We will end up with people like this Jabhat al-Nusra with chemical weapons because of this double standard.
Allow me here to ask you one last question, if I may. In quote, Why Iran Should Get the Bomb, published last year in Foreign Affairs, late Kenneth Waltz posited that nuclear deterrence between competitive or even antagonistic states, like for example between the United States and the Soviet Union, is uniquely stabilizing. In his view, power that is unbalanced by countervailing power is the ultimate source of instability in international affairs.
It's a very, very important argument, and he was a giant in American academia. He died recently, and he really was a giant with a tremendous amount of influence over the thinking of many people that I respect and myself. I think his core idea that one country having nuclear weapons in the Middle East is destabilizing. Israel having nuclear weapons in the Middle East is destabilizing. It enables Israel to attack its neighbors whenever, wherever, and with whatever degree of force it wants, because it has this nuclear umbrella to protect it. That is destabilizing. But where I think Professor Waltz is incorrect or underestimates culture in geopolitics is that he assumes that the Islamic Republic almost doesn't matter, that it is Iran. that Iran is no different than Israel, that Iran is no different than Pakistan, that Iran is no different than India, and that Iran, like that, would want nuclear weapons to balance these other countries. And that was true under the Shah. But that is not true under, or not necessarily true, under the Islamic Republic. From what we understand in talking to a range of senior Iranian officials, thinkers, academics, and actually reading and listening to the speeches of Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, is that the Islamic Republic has a very different conception of its national security, and that it looks at the acquisition of nuclear weapons as itself destabilizing. We've been told by a range of people inside the Islamic Republic that they look at Israel's acquisition of nuclear weapons as something that actually harms Israel, that pushes Israel to overreach, to delegitimate itself in its neighborhood. The same thing for Pakistan, the same thing they argued for the Soviet Union, that without the nuclear umbrella, maybe the Soviet Union wouldn't have invaded Afghanistan. And that's not something that they want. Now, all of this may be untrue. The supreme leader and everybody in Iran may not be telling the truth. That's what is assumed in Washington. But it just may be right. It may just be that the Islamic Republic has a different concept of national security than we do.
It's a matter of trust, maybe.
Well, and it should be taken seriously and looked at and understood on its own terms.
Right.
It may be wrong in the end, but it is something that for 32 years has been pretty consistently applied. If I may just add, because I think this is a very important point, Americans tend to ignore it, and it gets to your earlier question about Halabja. When the Islamic Republic was under attack by Iraq with chemical weapons, the Islamic Republic, from Ayatollah Khomeini and others, decided not to respond in kind. Iran then, under the Islamic Republic, could have relatively easily weaponized its chemical stockpiles to use to retaliate against Iraq. Because it was being attacked with chemical weapons, it could have done it. It decided not to. You can't explain that by saying Iran is just like Israel, just like Pakistan, just like India. You can't explain it that way. You have to take seriously this element of culture, that the Islamic Republic has a different way, that it actually succeeded for the first time in 100 years. It succeeded in keeping every inch of its territory completely under its sovereignty by not using weapons of mass destruction against Iraq, even though it had been attacked. It succeeded with a different policy. And so there may be something serious that the United States should learn from that.
Right. Hillary Leveritt, former National Security Council Middle East expert. Many thanks indeed for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You're most welcome, ma'am. إذن لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@almayadeen.net من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. إلى اللقاء.